The alarm clock buzzed at exactly 5:30 in the morning, just like it had every day for the past 3 years. Sarah Mitchell rolled out of bed with the precise movements of someone who had been waking up early for most of her adult life. Her small apartment was neat and organized, everything in its proper place. The walls were bare except for a few generic landscapes she had bought at a department store. Nothing personal. Nothing that would make visitors ask questions. She pulled on her jogging clothes and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The suburban neighborhood was still asleep, windows dark, driveways empty except for the occasional newspaper delivery truck. Sarah preferred it this way. Quiet. Anonymous. Forgettable. Her running route took her past identical houses with perfectly maintained lawns and matching mailboxes. She knew some of her neighbors by sight now, but they only saw her as the quiet woman from apartment 2B who kept to herself and never caused any trouble. Mrs. Henderson from down the hall sometimes nodded politely when they passed in the hallway. Mr. Chen from across the parking lot occasionally waved when he was taking out his trash. They had no idea that the unremarkable woman jogging past their windows had once been featured on the cover of Military Aviation Weekly magazine. Sarah finished her 5-mile run in exactly 38 minutes, the same time she had maintained for the past year. Consistency was important. Routines kept you grounded when everything else in your life had changed beyond recognition. She showered, dressed in khaki pants and a polo shirt with the Riverside Municipal Airport logo, and ate breakfast while watching the morning news. The weather would be perfect for flying today. Clear skies, light winds, good visibility. Her students would be happy. The drive to the airport took 22 minutes through traffic that was just beginning to build as the city woke up. Riverside Municipal was a small facility that served general aviation aircraft and flight training schools. No military jets here, no supersonic engines screaming overhead, no urgent briefings about classified missions. Just civilian pilots learning to fly Cessnas and Pipers, and instructors like Sarah who taught them the basics of aviation. She parked her Honda Civic in the instructor lot and grabbed her flight bag from the back seat. The bag was well-worn leather, a gift from her squadron mates when she had left active duty. Inside were charts, checklists, logbooks, and emergency procedures manuals. Standard instructor equipment. Nothing that would hint at the fact that she had once memorized classified flight procedures for aircraft that officially didn't exist. The flight school office was already busy when Sarah walked in. Jenny Martinez, the scheduling coordinator, was on the phone with a student trying to reschedule a lesson. Tom Bradley, another instructor, was reviewing weather reports at his desk. Mike Peterson, the school's chief instructor, was drinking coffee and complaining about paperwork requirements from the Federal Aviation Administration. "Morning, Sarah," Mike called out as she signed in. "You've got 3 students today. Johnson at 8, Williams at 10, and that new kid Patterson at 2 this afternoon." Sarah nodded and checked her schedule. Johnson was working on his commercial pilot license and needed practice with instrument approaches. Williams was a weekend warrior who flew for fun and wanted to brush up on crosswind landings. Patterson was 17 years old and saving money from his part-time job to pay for flying lessons because he dreamed of becoming an airline pilot someday. She enjoyed teaching, even if it was nothing like the flying she used to do. There was satisfaction in watching students progress from nervous beginners who gripped the controls too tightly to confident pilots who could handle their aircraft with skill and precision. Some of them reminded her of herself at that age, hungry to fly anything with wings and convinced they were destined for greatness in the sky. Of course, none of them knew that their quiet instructor had once been one of only 12 women selected to fly the F-22 Raptor in combat operations. They didn't know she had completed over 200 combat sorties in Iraq and Afghanistan. They had no idea that she had been shot down twice and survived both times through a combination of skill, training, and what her commanding officers had called supernatural luck. To them, she was just Sarah, the instructor who was patient with their mistakes and never raised her voice when they forgot to check their blind spots or came in too fast on landing. At 7:45, Robert Johnson arrived for his lesson. He was a 35-year-old accountant who worked for a local real estate company and flew on weekends. Johnson was a decent pilot who took instruction well and rarely made the same mistake twice. Today they would be working on precision approaches using the airport's instrument landing system. "How's the wife doing?" Sarah asked as they performed the pre-flight inspection on the Cessna 172 they would be flying. "Good, thanks for asking. She's still not thrilled about me spending so much money on flying, but she's getting used to it." Johnson ran his hand along the wing, checking for any damage or irregularities. My daughter wants to start taking lessons when she turns 16 next year.
Flying runs in families sometimes, Sarah said, though she couldn't speak from personal experience.
Her own family had been horrified when she joined the Air Force instead of going to college like her parents had planned. They had never understood her need to fly, her certainty that she belonged in the cockpit of a fighter jet. Even now, they thought she had wasted her potential by choosing military service over a normal career.
The lesson went smoothly.
Johnson's instrument work was improving steadily, and he managed 3 consecutive approaches within acceptable tolerances. Sarah made notes in his logbook and scheduled his next session.
By 10:15, she was ready for her second student of the day.
Marcus Williams was already waiting by the aircraft when she arrived. Williams was in his 50s, a successful businessman who had learned to fly late in life and treated aviation as an expensive hobby. He owned his own Piper Cherokee and paid for regular instruction to stay sharp and learn new skills. Today he wanted to practice crosswind landings, always a challenging skill for pilots who didn't fly frequently. The wind was coming from the northwest at 15 knots, creating a perfect crosswind condition for runway 09. Sarah demonstrated the proper technique on the first landing, showing Williams how to crab into the wind during approach and, then, straighten the aircraft just before touchdown. Williams took the controls for the second attempt and did reasonably well, though he was a bit late applying the correction and touched down slightly sideways. "Better," Sarah said over the intercom. "But, you need to anticipate the correction earlier.
Start your straightening maneuver about 50 feet higher next time." Williams nodded and set up for another approach.
This time he corrected too early and had to add power to avoid landing short of the runway. Flying required constant adjustments and split-second decisions, skills that took years to develop and could never be completely mastered. Even experienced pilots sometimes struggled with challenging conditions. They practiced for an hour, with Williams gradually improving his technique. By the end of the session, he was making acceptable crosswind landings most of the time, though Sarah could see he still lacked the instinctive feel that came with thousands of hours of experience. She made encouraging notes in his logbook and reminded him to practice these skills regularly. Lunch was a sandwich from the airport vending machine, eaten alone in the instructor lounge while reading aviation magazines.
Sarah preferred eating alone.
Conversation with colleagues inevitably led to questions about her background, and she had learned that the truth created more problems than carefully constructed half-truths. It was easier to be seen as antisocial than to explain why a former fighter pilot was teaching teenagers how to fly Cessnas. Her afternoon student, 17-year-old Kenny Patterson, arrived 30 minutes early and spent the time studying aircraft performance charts. Kenny reminded Sarah of herself at that age, eager, dedicated, and absolutely certain that flying was his calling in life. He worked weekends at a local grocery store to pay for lessons and had already logged 40 hours of flight time, more than most students his age.
"Ready for today's lesson?" Sarah asked as they walked out to the aircraft. "Yes, ma'am. I've been practicing the emergency procedures you gave me last week."
Kenny's enthusiasm was infectious, even if his grammar needed work. Sarah had met dozens of young pilots like Kenny over the years, kids who lived and breathed aviation and couldn't imagine doing anything else with their lives.
Today's lesson focused on emergency procedures. Sarah had Kenny practice simulated engine failures, electrical emergencies, and emergency landings.
She was impressed by his composure under pressure and his systematic approach to problem solving. Many pilots panicked when things went wrong, but Kenny stayed calm and worked through each emergency checklist methodically.
"Good job today," Sarah told him as they secured the aircraft after landing. "You're developing good judgment. That's more important than flying skills sometimes."
Kenny beamed at the praise. At 17, he couldn't imagine a future that didn't involve flying, and Sarah wasn't going to be the one to tell him how difficult it could be to make a career in aviation. Some dreams were worth protecting, at least for a while longer.
The afternoon was winding down when Mike Peterson approached her desk.
Mike was a good chief instructor who treated his staff fairly and rarely interfered with their teaching methods. He had been running flight schools for 20 years and had developed a reputation for producing competent, safe pilots. "Sarah, we've got a situation developing," Mike said, his voice unusually serious.
"I just got a call from the tower.
There's an aircraft in distress about 60 miles north of here."
Sarah looked up from the logbook she was completing.
Aircraft emergencies were unfortunately common in general aviation, usually mechanical problems or fuel exhaustion. The local Rescue Coordination Center handled most emergency situations, coordinating search and rescue efforts when aircraft went down.
What kind of aircraft? She asked. That's the problem. It's not a civilian aircraft.
Some kind of military jet, probably from Edwards Air Force Base. The pilot declared an emergency about 20 minutes ago, and they've lost contact with him. Edwards Air Force Base was 200 miles away, but military aircraft regularly flew over Southern California airspace during training exercises.
If a military pilot was having problems, there were established procedures for handling the emergency.
Military aircraft had their own rescue resources and communication networks.
I'm not sure why they're calling civilian airports about it, Sarah said. Mike's expression grew more serious.
Because the aircraft is heading this way, and it sounds like the pilot might be unconscious.
The last transmission indicated some kind of cockpit emergency, possibly smoke or fumes. The tower wants all civilian traffic cleared from the area in case this thing comes down.
Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she used to get during mission briefings when the stakes were high and the margin for error was small. An unconscious pilot in a damaged military aircraft was a nightmare scenario. Without conscious control, the aircraft would eventually run out of fuel and crash wherever it happened to be flying.
What type of aircraft? She asked again. Mike checked his notes. They said it's an F-22. Whatever that means. Sarah's blood went cold.
The F-22 Raptor was the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, a $200 million weapon system loaded with classified technology and enough fuel to fly for hundreds of miles. If the pilot was unconscious and the aircraft was flying on autopilot, it could crash anywhere in Southern California.
Urban areas. Schools. Hospitals. Shopping centers.
And she was probably the only person within 200 miles who knew how to fly one. Sarah stared at Mike for a long moment, her mind racing through calculations she hadn't made in 3 years.
Flight time from Edwards to their location. Fuel consumption rates for the F-22 at various altitudes.
Emergency procedures for cockpit contamination. The information came flooding back as if she had reviewed it yesterday, muscle memory encoded in neural pathways that years of civilian flying hadn't erased.
Sarah? You okay?
Mike was looking at her with concern.
You look like you've seen a ghost.
She forced herself to appear calm, though her heart was pounding.
Just thinking about flight paths.
If a military jet is heading this way, we should definitely clear the airspace. Mike nodded and reached for his radio to contact the tower.
While he coordinated with air traffic control, Sarah stepped outside and scanned the horizon. The sky was clear and blue, with scattered clouds at 8,000 feet.
Perfect flying weather that was about to become perfect crashing weather if something wasn't done soon. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her neighbor Mrs. Henderson asking if she could water her plants while she was out of town.
Sarah deleted the message without responding.
Mrs. Henderson's plants seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of an F-22 Raptor crashing into a populated area with enough explosive force to level a city block. Through the office windows, she could see Mike on the radio, probably coordinating the airspace closure with approach control. Other instructors were gathering around his desk, curious about the unusual activity. Tom Bradley was asking questions and pointing at sectional charts spread across the table. Jenny Martinez was calling students to cancel afternoon lessons. Sarah walked to her car and opened the trunk, retrieving a small metal box she kept hidden under a spare tire. Inside the box were items she had hoped never to use again: her old Air Force identification card, emergency contact numbers for various military units, and a secure cell phone that would connect directly to classified networks. She had kept these things as insurance, never imagining she would actually need them. The secure phone connected on the second ring.
Operations Center, this is Sergeant Williams.
This is Colonel Mitchell, call sign Ghost, service number 2847 Delta Tango 7. I need to speak with someone about the F-22 emergency in progress over Southern California. There was a pause, then the sound of typing.
Ma'am, I show you as retired from active duty. Are you calling in an official capacity?
Sarah looked toward the airport office where her colleagues were still discussing the situation. I'm calling because I'm probably the only qualified F-22 pilot within 300 miles of the emergency location.
Another pause, longer this time.
Please hold, ma'am. The hold music was an instrumental version of the Air Force song, something Sarah found grimly appropriate under the circumstances. She watched a Cessna taxi past the terminal building, its student pilot practicing turns and stops under the guidance of an instructor. Normal people doing normal things while an unmanned fighter aircraft flew toward them loaded with enough fuel to create a fireball visible from space.
Colonel Mitchell? This is Major Reynolds, Operations Duty Officer. We've been briefed on your background. What's your current location?
Sarah gave him the airport coordinates and explained her position as a civilian flight instructor. Major Reynolds confirmed the basic facts of the emergency. An F-22 from Edwards had experienced cockpit contamination during a routine training flight. The pilot had declared an emergency and indicated he was losing consciousness. The last radio transmission had been garbled and unintelligible.
Current position shows the aircraft heading southeast at 28,000 feet, speed approximately 400 knots. Estimated fuel remaining is about 90 minutes.
Sarah did rapid calculations in her head. The aircraft was flying toward one of the most densely populated regions in the United States.
Los Angeles. Orange County.
Millions of people living and working in an area that would be directly in the flight path. "What's the intercept plan?" she asked.
"We've got two F-16s scrambled from March Air Reserve Base, but they're 20 minutes out."
Even when they reach the aircraft, there's not much they can do if the pilot is unconscious. Sarah knew the limitations of aerial intercepts with unconscious pilots. The F-16s could try to establish radio contact, but they couldn't take control of another aircraft.
They could observe and report, but they couldn't prevent a crash.
In the worst-case scenario, they might be ordered to shoot down the F-22 before it reached a populated area, trading one pilot's life for potentially thousands of civilian casualties.
"I need to get airborne," Sarah said.
"Ma'am, you're not authorized for military operations.
You've been retired for 3 years. I'm not asking for authorization. I'm telling you that an F-22 is about to crash somewhere in Southern California, and I might be able to prevent it."
There was background noise on the line, voices discussing options and protocols. Sarah could imagine the scene in the operations center, duty officers consulting manuals, supervisors making phone calls to higher headquarters, everyone trying to figure out how to handle an unprecedented situation. "Colonel Mitchell, even if we could authorize your involvement, you don't have access to a suitable aircraft. The F-22 is flying at 28,000 feet and 400 knots.
You'd need a high-performance interceptor to reach it."
Sarah looked toward the far end of the airport, where a chain-link fence separated the civilian facility from a small Air National Guard unit that used the field for weekend training exercises. She had noticed their aircraft during her 3 years at Riverside but had never paid much attention to them. Now she wished she had been more observant. "What's stationed at the guard unit here?" she asked.
More typing, then Major Reynolds came back on the line. "Shows a detachment from the 144th Fighter Wing. They've got two F-16s assigned for training operations." F-16s.
Sarah had flown F-16s early in her career, before transitioning to the F-22 program. They were older aircraft but still capable of high-altitude, high-speed flight. More importantly, they were probably fueled and ready for a training mission that had been cancelled due to the emergency airspace closure. "I need access to one of those aircraft," Sarah said.
"Ma'am, that's not possible.
You're not current in type, you haven't flown military aircraft in 3 years, and you don't have authorization for." Sarah ended the call and dialed a different number, one she hadn't used since leaving active duty.
The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. "General Morrison's office, this is Captain Blake." "This is Sarah Mitchell."
"I need to speak with the general immediately."
"Colonel Mitchell? I thought you were retired." "I am retired."
"And right now there's an F-22 heading for Los Angeles with an unconscious pilot. I need 5 minutes with General Morrison." General Morrison had been Sarah's wing commander during her final assignment before retirement. He had tried to convince her to stay in the Air Force, offering her promotion opportunities and choice assignments. She had declined, burned out from years of combat deployments and ready for a quieter life. Now she was about to ask him for the biggest favor of her career.
"Sarah? What's going on?"
General Morrison's voice was crisp and professional, but she could hear genuine concern beneath the military bearing. Sarah explained the situation quickly and concisely, using the briefing style she had perfected over 15 years of military service.
aircraft type, location, probable cause of emergency, current status, and recommended course of action.
General Morrison listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. You're asking me to authorize a retired officer to take unauthorized control of a military aircraft to attempt an intercept mission with an unconscious pilot, he said when she finished.
Yes, sir. Do you have any idea how many regulations that would violate? Hundreds, probably.
But I also know that F-22 is going to crash somewhere, and I might be the only person who can prevent it from happening in a populated area.
There was a long pause.
Sarah could hear background noise in the general's office, probably staff members discussing the emergency. Everyone would be watching radar displays and tracking the aircraft's progress, calculating impact zones and casualty estimates.
What makes you think you can succeed where other options might fail? General Morrison asked. Sarah had been expecting this question.
Because I've been in that cockpit, sir. I know the aircraft systems, the emergency procedures, the backup controls. If the primary pilot is unconscious, there might still be ways to influence the aircraft's flight path using remote systems or emergency overrides. But it requires getting close enough to establish a data link connection.
And you think you can fly an F-16 to intercept altitude after 3 years of civilian flying?
I think I'm the best option available, sir. Another pause, then, the sound of General Morrison consulting with someone else in his office. Sarah used the time to study the Air National Guard facility across the fence from the civilian airport. She could see aircraft hangars and what appeared to be maintenance vehicles. If there were F-16 stationed there, they would be in the hangars or on the flight line, hopefully fueled and ready for operation. Sarah, I'm going to do something that will probably end my career, General Morrison said.
I'm authorizing you to take whatever action you deem necessary to prevent civilian casualties from this emergency. Consider yourself recalled to temporary active duty as of right now. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with terror.
She had just been handed authorization to steal a fighter aircraft and attempt an intercept mission that could easily result in her death or the deaths of thousands of innocent people.
Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Just bring everyone home safely. Sarah ended the call and looked toward the Air National Guard facility.
Getting access would require getting past security fences, convincing Guard personnel to let her near their aircraft, and then, hoping she could remember how to operate systems she hadn't touched in 3 years.
It seemed impossible.
But impossible was better than doing nothing while an F-22 crashed into downtown Los Angeles. She walked back into the flight school office, where Mike Peterson was still coordinating with air traffic control. The other instructors looked up as she entered, their faces showing the stress of an unprecedented situation.
Mike, I need to tell you something, Sarah said. And you're not going to believe it. Mike Peterson looked up from his radio with exhaustion written across his face.
The past hour had been a constant stream of phone calls, airspace closures, and coordination with military officials who seemed to change their story every few minutes.
The last thing he needed was another complication from one of his instructors. Sarah, unless it's directly related to this emergency, can it wait?
I've got 3 different agencies telling me different things about it is related to the emergency, Sarah interrupted.
And what I'm about to tell you is going to sound completely insane. Tom Bradley and Jenny Martinez stopped their own conversations to listen.
The office had become a crisis management center, with sectional charts spread across every surface and multiple radios crackling with air traffic control updates. The atmosphere was tense, the kind of controlled chaos that developed when experienced aviation professionals faced a situation they had never encountered before.
Sarah took a deep breath. The F-22 that's heading this way? I used to fly them. For 15 years, I was an Air Force fighter pilot. My call sign was Ghost. The office went completely silent.
Mike stared at her as if she had announced she was secretly a movie star or professional athlete.
Tom Bradley's mouth actually fell open.
Jenny Martinez set down her coffee cup with a slight clink that seemed loud in the sudden quiet. Sarah, Mike said slowly, you've been teaching Cessna students for 3 years.
You've never mentioned any military background. Because I didn't want to mention it.
I retired from the Air Force and came here specifically because I wanted a quiet, normal life away from all the military stuff.
Sarah could see disbelief in their faces, and she couldn't blame them.
The idea that their mild-mannered colleague had been a combat pilot seemed absurd even to her.
Prove it, Tom said bluntly.
Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her old military identification card, the one she had retrieved from the box in her car. The photo showed her in dress blue uniform with captain's bars on her shoulders. Her hair was shorter in the picture, and her face looked harder, more serious. It was the face of someone who had seen combat and made life-or-death decisions on a regular basis.
Mike examined the ID card carefully, reading every detail. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force. This says you retired 3 years ago. He looked up at her with new understanding. Colonel? I was promoted to colonel just before retirement. Most people don't know that flight instructors can have military backgrounds. We don't usually advertise it. Jenny Martinez was shaking her head in amazement.
You mean all this time, when we've been talking about flying and giving you advice about students, you were trying to be polite and not mention that I had more flight experience than everyone in this room combined, Sarah finished.
Look, my background isn't important right now.
What's important is that F-22 flying toward Los Angeles, and I might be able to do something about it.
Mike handed back her identification card. What kind of something?
Sarah pointed to the Air National Guard facility visible through the office windows.
Those F-16s across the fence.
I need access to one of them so I can intercept the F-22 before it reaches populated areas.
The silence returned, even deeper than before.
Sarah could see her colleagues processing the implications of what she had just proposed.
Tom Bradley was the first to speak. You want to steal a military fighter jet?
I want to borrow a military fighter jet with proper authorization to prevent a catastrophic aircraft accident. Sarah showed them her secure phone, which was still displaying her last call to General Morrison's office.
I've been temporarily recalled to active duty for this emergency.
Mike was studying her face, trying to reconcile the quiet flight instructor he had known for 3 years with the combat pilot standing before him. Sarah, even if what you're saying is true, you haven't flown military aircraft in years. Those things are incredibly complex and dangerous.
Less dangerous than an unmanned F-22 crashing into downtown Los Angeles, Sarah replied.
Mike, that aircraft is carrying about 8,000 pounds of fuel. When it hits the ground, it's going to create an explosion that will level everything within a quarter mile. If it comes down in a populated area, we could be looking at thousands of casualties. Jenny Martinez was checking her computer, probably looking up information about F-22 aircraft and their capabilities.
How do you know so much about the fuel load?
Because I've flown hundreds of hours in F-22s. I know exactly how much fuel they carry, how fast they burn it, and what happens when they crash. Sarah could see doubt in their faces, and she didn't have time for a lengthy explanation of her military career. Look, I understand this is hard to believe, but we don't have time to discuss my qualifications.
Every minute we waste talking is a minute closer to impact. Mike made a decision. What do you need from us?
Access to the guard facility and someone who can help me get through their security. I also need you to coordinate with air traffic control to make sure I have a clear departure path once I get airborne.
Tom Bradley was looking at sectional charts, tracing flight paths with his finger. The guard unit has been pretty quiet lately. I'm not sure they even have anyone on duty today. Sarah had considered that possibility. Weekend guard units often operated with minimal staffing, especially during non-flying periods.
If the facility was locked down or unmanned, she would have to find another way to access their aircraft.
Only one way to find out, she said. Mike, can you call the tower and find out if the guard unit is active today?
While Mike made the call, Sarah gathered her flight gear and tried to prepare mentally for flying a fighter aircraft after 3 years of civilian aviation. The basic skills would still be there, encoded in muscle memory and thousands of hours of training. But fighters were unforgiving aircraft that demanded split-second reactions and precise control inputs. Even experienced pilots could make fatal mistakes if they weren't completely focused. Mike finished his call and turned back to the group. Good news and bad news. The guard unit has 2 F-16s on the flight line, fueled and ready for a training mission that was cancelled due to the airspace closure. Bad news is they only have 3 people on duty, and none of them are pilots.
Sarah felt a mix of relief and concern.
Available aircraft was good news, but she would need cooperation from the guard personnel to get access. Military facilities took security seriously, especially when it came to fighter aircraft. She couldn't simply walk up to the fence and ask to borrow a $2 billion weapon system.
I'll deal with the guard personnel, she said. Jenny, can you help me with something?
Jenny looked up from her computer, where she had been reading articles about F-22 capabilities and recent Air Force operations.
What do you need?
Call the local news stations and tell them to broadcast emergency warnings about possible aircraft debris. Don't mention specific details, just advise people in the area to stay indoors and away from windows until further notice.
Sarah, Mike said quietly, are you really sure about this? I mean, what you're proposing to do. Sarah met his eyes and saw genuine concern for her safety.
Mike had been a good boss and a decent man who cared about his employees. She appreciated his worry, but there wasn't time for sentiment. Mike, I spent 15 years flying combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've been shot down twice and survived both times. I've landed damaged aircraft on carriers in the middle of storms and flown humanitarian missions into war zones. This is what I trained for my entire military career.
Tom Bradley was shaking his head. But why didn't you ever mention any of this?
I mean, we've been working together for 3 years.
Because I wanted to leave that life behind.
I was tired of combat and missions and constant pressure. I came here because I wanted to teach kids how to fly and live a quiet, normal life. Sarah looked around the office at charts and radios and the controlled chaos of an aviation emergency.
Apparently, normal wasn't an option.
Jenny Martinez had finished her calls to local media and was monitoring radio transmissions from air traffic control. Sarah, they're saying the F-22 has changed course slightly.
It's now heading more toward Orange County than Los Angeles.
Orange County was densely populated but not quite as urban as downtown Los Angeles.
Still, a fighter aircraft crash anywhere in Southern California would be catastrophic.
Sarah checked her watch and calculated flight times and fuel consumption rates.
How long until those F-16s from March reach intercept position?
Maybe 15 minutes, Mike replied, consulting his notes from previous radio calls. 15 minutes might be too late, depending on the F-22's exact flight path and remaining fuel.
Sarah needed to get airborne as soon as possible, even if it meant taking risks that would normally be unacceptable. I'm going to the guard facility, she announced. If anyone asks where I went, tell them I'm trying to prevent a disaster.
She headed for the door but stopped when Jenny called her name.
Sarah?
Be careful. I know we don't really know you, but just be careful.
Sarah nodded and walked outside into the afternoon sunlight.
The civilian airport looked peaceful and normal, with aircraft parked neatly on the flight line and maintenance crews going about their routine tasks. None of them knew that their quiet colleague was about to attempt something that belonged in an action movie rather than real life. The Air National Guard facility was separated from the civilian airport by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Sarah could see 2 F-16s parked near a hangar, their sleek gray forms looking lethal even when motionless on the ground. Security cameras monitored the perimeter, and warning signs indicated that unauthorized access was prohibited by federal law.
Sarah walked along the fence until she found the main gate, which was secured with an electronic lock.
A small guard shack stood next to the entrance, but it appeared to be empty. She pressed the intercom button and waited.
Guard duty office, Sergeant Murphy speaking. Sergeant Murphy, this is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force. I need immediate access to your facility for an emergency operation.
There was a pause, then, the sound of movement inside the guard shack. A young man in Air National Guard uniform appeared at the window, looking skeptical about the woman in civilian clothes claiming to be a military officer. Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification and verify your authorization for access. Sarah held up her military ID card and her secure phone, which showed her active status for the emergency operation. Sergeant, there's an F-22 heading for a populated area with an unconscious pilot. I'm the closest qualified pilot available to attempt an intercept. Every second we waste could mean thousands of civilian casualties. Sergeant Murphy studied her identification carefully, then made a phone call to verify her credentials. Sarah could hear him speaking to someone in the operations center, probably confirming her recall to active duty and authorization for emergency operations. While she waited, Sarah studied the F-16s on the flight line. Both aircraft appeared to be in good condition, with external fuel tanks that indicated they were configured for long-range training missions. One aircraft had its canopy open, suggesting it might have been in preparation for flight when the emergency began. Sergeant Murphy finished his call and returned to the window. Colonel, I've confirmed your credentials and emergency authorization. But, I have to tell you, there are no qualified pilots on duty to assist with pre-flight procedures.
Sarah had expected this problem. Fighter aircraft required complex pre-flight inspections and system checks that normally involved multiple personnel.
She would have to rely on her own knowledge and hope that years of civilian flying hadn't dulled her memory of military procedures. "I'll handle my own pre-flight," she said. "I just need access to the aircraft and assistance with ground power and communication systems." Sergeant Murphy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the unusual situation. Sarah could see him weighing regulations against the emergency circumstances, trying to make a decision that no training manual had prepared him for. "Sergeant," Sarah said gently, "in about 30 minutes, an F-22 Raptor is going to crash somewhere in Southern California. I'm the only person within 300 miles who might be able to prevent that crash.
Are you going to help me, or are we going to follow regulations while thousands of people die?"
Sergeant Murphy made his decision and unlocked the gate. The gate clicked open and Sarah stepped onto the Air National Guard facility for the first time in 3 years. The familiar smell hit her immediately: jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic scent of military aircraft. It was a smell that brought back memories of briefing rooms and flight lines, of pre-dawn missions and post-flight debriefs. For 3 years she had avoided military bases, preferring the simpler world of civilian aviation. Now she was back, and it felt like coming home to a house she had tried to forget. Sergeant Murphy led her across the tarmac toward the F-16s.
Both aircraft were single-seat fighters, painted in the standard gray camouflage scheme used by Air National Guard units.
The closer aircraft had tail number 86-0291, and Sarah could see that its systems were already powered up for the training mission that had been cancelled.
"Colonel, I need to ask, when was the last time you flew one of these?" Sergeant Murphy gestured toward the F-16s with obvious concern.
Sarah did rapid calculations in her head.
Her last F-16 flight had been during transition training before moving to the F-22 program.
That was over 8 years ago. She had accumulated nearly 1,000 hours in F-16s during her early career, but 8 years was a long time in aviation. Aircraft systems changed, procedures were updated, and pilot skills degraded without regular practice.
"It's been a while," she admitted. "But it's like riding a bicycle. Some things you never forget." Sergeant Murphy didn't look convinced, and Sarah couldn't blame him.
The difference between a bicycle and a supersonic fighter aircraft was roughly equivalent to the difference between a rowboat and a nuclear submarine. But there wasn't time for extensive requalification training or gentle refresher courses. Either she could fly the F-16 well enough to intercept the F-22, or thousands of people were about to die in a spectacular aircraft accident. They reached the aircraft and Sarah began her inspection. The F-16 was a beautiful machine, all clean lines and purposeful angles. The single-engine air intake gaped like a hungry mouth beneath the cockpit. External fuel tanks hung from wing pylons, extending the aircraft's range for long training missions.
Everything looked normal and well-maintained. "What's the fuel load?" Sarah asked. Sergeant Murphy consulted a clipboard. "Full internal fuel plus externals. About 12,000 pounds total."
The aircraft was configured for a 4-hour training mission.
12,000 pounds of fuel would give her plenty of range and loiter time to attempt an intercept.
The F-16 single engine was powerful enough to climb to 30,000 feet and accelerate to supersonic speeds, matching the performance envelope of the runaway F-22. Sarah climbed the ladder to inspect the cockpit. The familiar layout brought back memories of hundreds of training flights and combat missions.
The heads-up display mounted above the instrument panel.
The hands-on throttle and stick controls that allowed pilots to operate critical systems without taking their eyes off the target. The ejection seat with its complex web of straps and connections.
But there were differences too. Updated displays showing digital information instead of analog gauges.
New communication systems and navigation equipment. Software upgrades and system modifications implemented during the years since she had last flown this type of aircraft. "Sergeant Murphy, I need ground power and communication checks."
"Can you get someone to help with that?" "Yes, ma'am.
Sergeant Williams is our crew chief today, and he knows the aircraft systems." Sarah continued her inspection while Sergeant Murphy called for assistance. The F-16's general condition was excellent, with no obvious maintenance issues or warning tags. The Air National Guard took aircraft maintenance seriously, and their part-time status didn't prevent them from maintaining professional standards. Sergeant Williams arrived within minutes, an older man with the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades working on fighter aircraft. He took one look at Sarah and raised his eyebrows questioningly. "Colonel Mitchell is conducting an emergency intercept mission," Sergeant Murphy explained quickly. "She needs ground power and communication checks as soon as possible."
Sergeant Williams nodded professionally and began connecting ground power cables to the aircraft.
Military maintenance personnel were accustomed to unusual situations and rapid changes in mission requirements. Sarah appreciated his no-questions-asked approach to getting the aircraft ready for flight. "Ma'am, communication systems are online and checked good," Sergeant Williams reported. "Ground power is connected, and all aircraft systems show normal indications." Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began strapping herself into the ejection seat. The familiar ritual of buckles and connections felt automatic, like muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. She adjusted her helmet and connected communication and oxygen lines.
The cockpit came alive as aircraft systems powered up. Displays glowed with system status information and navigation data.
The heads-up display projected flight information directly in front of her eyes. Warning lights tested themselves in sequence, then went dark as each system reported normal operation. Sarah began working through the pre-flight checklist from memory, testing flight controls and verifying system configurations. Each switch position and control movement felt familiar despite the years away from military flying. The training had been thorough and repetitive, designed to create automatic responses that would persist even under extreme stress. Her secure phone buzzed with an incoming call.
Major Reynolds from the Operations Center was back on the line with updated information about the emergency. "Colonel Mitchell, the F-22 has descended to 24,000 feet and reduced speed to 350 knots. We think the autopilot is compensating for some kind of system degradation." Autopilot compensation was both good news and bad news. Good because it meant the aircraft was still controllable and not in an immediate dive toward the ground. Bad because system degradation could lead to unpredictable behavior or complete autopilot failure at any time. "What's the current position and heading?" Sarah asked while continuing her pre-flight procedures. "Approximately 40 miles northwest of your location, heading 140 degrees. Current track will take it over the Inland Empire and possibly toward Orange County." The Inland Empire was a heavily populated region east of Los Angeles, home to millions of people living in suburban communities. If the F-22 crashed there, the casualty count could be enormous. Estimated time to populated areas? 25 minutes at current speed and heading. 25 minutes. Sarah needed to get airborne immediately and climb to intercept altitude as quickly as possible. She signaled to Sergeant Williams that she was ready for engine start. "Clear to start engine," Sergeant Williams called out, moving to a safe position away from the aircraft. Sarah pressed the engine start button and felt the F-16 single turbofan engine begin its startup sequence. The familiar whine of the turbine spinning up to operational speed filled the cockpit. Engine parameters climbed steadily toward normal operating ranges. "Engine start complete, all parameters normal," she reported over the radio. "Requesting immediate taxi clearance for emergency departure." The control tower at Riverside Municipal had been briefed on the situation and granted immediate clearance. Sarah released the parking brake and began taxiing toward the runway, running through final system checks as the aircraft rolled across the tarmac. The F-16 felt different from the civilian aircraft she had been flying for 3 years. More responsive, more powerful, more alive. The controls required precise inputs and constant attention. This was a machine designed for combat, where split-second reactions could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah reached the runway and aligned the aircraft for takeoff. The tower cleared her for immediate departure with no delays. She advanced the throttle to full military power and felt the engine's thrust press her back into the ejection seat. The F-16 accelerated rapidly down the runway, gaining speed at a rate that would terrify civilian pilots. At 150 knots, Sarah pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft lift off cleanly. The ground fell away as she entered a steep climb toward intercept altitude. The familiar sensation of high-performance flight returned immediately, as if the intervening years of civilian flying had never happened. "Riverside Tower, Ghost 1 is airborne and climbing to flight level 300. Requesting vector to intercept emergency aircraft.
Ghost 1, turn left heading 320 degrees, climb and maintain flight level 300.
You are cleared direct to intercept.
Sarah banked the F-16 toward the northwest and continued climbing through 20,000 feet. The aircraft performed flawlessly, with all systems operating normally. Below her, Southern California spread out like a detailed map, urban areas giving way to mountains and desert in the distance. Her radio crackled with a transmission from the F-16's launched from March Air Reserve Base. Ghost 1, Ranger flight is 20 miles south of your position, climbing to intercept altitude.
What's your plan for the emergency aircraft?
Sarah keyed her microphone while monitoring her climb rate and heading. Ranger flight, I'm going to attempt close approach to assess pilot condition and aircraft status.
If the pilot is conscious, I'll try to establish communication and guide him to a safe landing. If he's unconscious, I'll attempt to activate emergency systems remotely.
Ghost 1, be advised that remote system activation on F-22 aircraft requires classified procedures and encrypted data links.
Sarah smiled grimly. The other pilots didn't know about her F-22 background, and she wasn't about to explain it over an unsecured radio channel. Ranger flight, I'm familiar with F-22 emergency procedures.
She leveled off at 30,000 feet and began scanning the sky for visual contact with the emergency aircraft.
The F-22 should be visible as a distant speck against the blue sky, probably slightly below her altitude and ahead of her current position.
Her radar detected a contact approximately 15 miles ahead, flying straight and level at 24,000 feet.
Speed showed 350 knots, consistent with the last reported data from air traffic control.
Sarah locked onto the target and began a gentle descent to intercept altitude. As she closed the distance, the emergency aircraft became visible as a gray diamond shape against the sky. The F-22 Raptor was unmistakable, with its angular stealth configuration and twin vertical stabilizers. From her position slightly behind and above, Sarah could see that the aircraft appeared to be flying normally, with no visible damage or smoke.
Ghost 1 has visual contact with emergency aircraft, she transmitted.
F-22 appears to be in normal flight configuration, no obvious external damage.
Sarah maneuvered to a position alongside the F-22, about 500 feet away.
Through the canopy, she could see the pilot slumped forward in his ejection seat, apparently unconscious. His helmet was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his hands were not visible on the flight controls. The sight of an unconscious pilot in a runaway fighter aircraft was every aviator's nightmare. Sarah had seen similar situations during her military career, usually ending in tragedy despite the best efforts of rescue personnel.
But this time was different. This time she might be able to do something about it. She moved closer to the F-22, using gentle control inputs to maintain formation flight.
The aircraft was flying smoothly on autopilot, but she could see subtle variations in altitude and heading that suggested system instability. Whatever had caused the cockpit contamination was also affecting the aircraft's flight control systems. Sarah activated her aircraft's encrypted communication system and attempted to establish a data link with the F-22. If she could access the emergency aircraft's computer systems, she might be able to override the autopilot and take remote control of the aircraft.
The data link connection failed.
Either the F-22 systems were too damaged to respond, or the aircraft was using security protocols that prevented external access. Sarah tried several different communication frequencies and encryption modes, but nothing worked. She checked her navigation display and felt her heart sink.
The F-22 was now only 8 minutes from the outskirts of Orange County.
Below them, she could see the urban sprawl of Southern California spreading to the horizon. Millions of people going about their daily lives, unaware that a runaway fighter aircraft was heading toward them loaded with enough fuel to level several city blocks. Sarah made a decision that went against every safety regulation and common sense principle she had ever learned. She was going to get close enough to the F-22 to physically access its emergency systems. Sarah positioned her F-16 directly behind the F-22, studying the emergency aircraft's configuration and trying to formulate a plan that wouldn't result in both aircraft crashing into Orange County. What she was contemplating had never been attempted in real life, only discussed in theoretical emergency procedures that most pilots hoped they would never need to use. The F-22's external fuel dump ports were located on the underside of the aircraft, designed to allow pilots to jettison fuel quickly in emergency situations. If Sarah could somehow activate those systems remotely, she might be able to reduce the aircraft's weight and extend its flight time while emergency crews prepared a landing site. But, first, she needed to try something even more dangerous. Sarah eased her F-16 forward until she was flying directly underneath the F-22, separated by less than 50 feet of vertical distance. At this range, she could see details of the other aircraft's landing gear doors and weapons bay panels. More importantly, she could see the external antenna array used for emergency communications. Military aircraft were equipped with backup communication systems designed to function even when primary radios failed. These systems used different frequencies and protocols, and could sometimes be activated by external signals from other aircraft. Sarah began transmitting on every emergency frequency she could remember, hoping to establish contact with any functioning systems in the F-22. Emergency aircraft, this is Ghost 1 on guard frequency. If you can hear this transmission, activate your emergency transponder. Nothing. Sarah tried different frequencies and protocols, broadcasting blind calls in hopes that some part of the F-22's communication system would respond. She was flying so close to the larger aircraft that wake turbulence from its engines was buffeting her F-16, requiring constant control inputs to maintain position. Her fuel gauge showed that she was burning fuel rapidly during the high-altitude intercept. The F-16 had enough fuel for several more hours of flight, but she couldn't maintain this dangerous formation flying indefinitely. Either she found a solution soon, or she would have to break off and watch the F-22 crash somewhere in the urban sprawl below. Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from Ranger Flight, the F-16's from March Air Reserve Base. Ghost 1, we're approaching your position from the south. Recommend you clear the area so we can assess the situation. Sarah checked her navigation display and saw 2 radar contacts approaching rapidly from behind. The Ranger flight pilots were probably following standard intercept procedures, planning to observe the emergency aircraft from a safe distance and relay information to ground controllers. They had no way of knowing that the woman flying formation with an unconscious pilot had spent years developing the skills needed for exactly this type of emergency. Ranger Flight, maintain your distance, Sarah transmitted. I'm attempting emergency system activation. Ghost 1, you're flying dangerously close to the emergency aircraft. Recommend you clear to a safe distance. Sarah ignored the warning and continued her attempts to establish electronic contact with the F-22. She activated her aircraft's radar system and used it to scan the emergency aircraft at close range, looking for any signs of system activity or response to external signals. The radar sweep detected something unexpected. The F-22's weapon systems were active, with electronic signatures indicating that various sensors and computers were still functioning normally. This meant that the aircraft's primary systems were operational, even though the pilot was unconscious. Sarah realized that she might be able to access the F-22 systems through its own sensors. Military aircraft used sophisticated radar and communication networks that allowed them to exchange data during formation flying and combat operations. If she could establish the right type of electronic connection, she might be able to send control signals directly to the emergency aircraft's flight computers. She activated her F-16's tactical data system and began broadcasting formation flying signals used during training exercises. These signals were designed to allow multiple aircraft to coordinate their movements and share navigation information. Most importantly, they included emergency override codes that could be used to take control of other aircraft systems in extreme situations. The F-22's flight path began to change subtly. Instead of flying straight toward Orange County, the aircraft entered a shallow turn to the right. Sarah watched her navigation display and felt a surge of hope as the emergency aircraft's heading shifted from southeast to east, taking it away from the most densely populated areas. Ghost 1, did you just see that? Ranger Flight called. The emergency aircraft changed course. Roger, I'm attempting to guide it toward less populated areas, Sarah replied while fine-tuning her electronic signals to maintain control of the F-22's autopilot system. The formation flying override system was working, but it required constant adjustment and precise signal timing. Sarah found herself flying closer and closer to the F-22 as she worked to maintain the electronic connection. The two aircraft were now separated by less than 30 feet, close enough that she could see the unconscious pilot's oxygen mask and the condensation on the inside of his canopy. Sarah's plan was to guide the F-22 toward the desert areas east of Los Angeles, where a crash would cause minimal casualties. But, as she studied her navigation charts, she realized there might be an even better option. Edwards Air Force Base was approximately 100 miles to the northeast, with long runways and emergency response capabilities specifically designed for handling aircraft emergencies. The question was whether she could maintain control of the F-22's flight path long enough to guide it to Edwards, and whether the unconscious pilot would regain consciousness in time to land the aircraft safely. Sarah began transmitting new navigation signals to the F-22, gradually adjusting its heading toward Edwards Air Force Base. The emergency aircraft responded to her commands, banking slowly to the northeast while maintaining altitude and airspeed. But she could see fluctuations in the F-22's flight path that suggested its autopilot system was becoming less stable.
Ghost 1, what's your fuel status? Ranger Flight asked.
Sarah checked her gauges and realized she had been so focused on controlling the F-22 that she hadn't been monitoring her own aircraft systems. The F-16's fuel quantity was lower than expected, probably due to the high power settings required for close formation flying and the extended time at maximum altitude. Ghost 1 has approximately 40 minutes of fuel remaining, she reported. 40 minutes would be enough to guide the F-22 partway to Edwards, but not enough to complete the entire intercept mission. Sarah would need to hand off control to another aircraft or find a way to wake up the unconscious pilot before her own fuel ran critically low. She tried broadcasting voice messages directly into the F-22's intercom system, hoping that loud audio signals might penetrate whatever had caused the pilot to lose consciousness.
Emergency pilot, this is Ghost 1.
If you can hear this message, key your microphone twice.
Still no response.
Sarah could see the pilot's head moving slightly with the aircraft's vibrations, but there were no signs of consciousness or voluntary movement. Ranger Flight had moved into position on the opposite side of the formation and were now flying parallel to Sarah and the emergency aircraft. She could see the other pilots watching her through their cockpit windows, probably amazed by the close formation flying she was maintaining with an uncontrolled aircraft.
Ranger Leader to Ghost 1, we've been monitoring your formation flying signals. That's some impressive flying.
Thanks, but I need to maintain concentration, Sarah replied while adjusting her position to compensate for a slight altitude change in the F-22. The three aircraft continued flying northeast toward Edwards Air Force Base, with Sarah maintaining electronic control of the emergency aircraft's autopilot system. Below them, the urban areas of Southern California gradually gave way to desert and mountains. Each mile they flew away from populated areas reduced the potential casualty count if the F-22 eventually crashed. Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from Edwards Approach Control.
Ghost 1, this is Edwards Approach. We've been briefed on your situation and have emergency crews standing by. What's your estimate for arrival?
Sarah calculated flight times and fuel consumption rates in her head.
Edwards Approach, estimate 25 minutes to your airspace.
Be advised that the emergency aircraft pilot is still unconscious, and I may not be able to maintain control for the entire flight.
Roger, Ghost 1. We have crash rescue crews and medical personnel standing by. Are you planning to attempt a remote landing? Remote landing.
Sarah had considered the possibility, but it would require maintaining electronic control of the F-22 throughout the approach and touchdown phases of flight. Even the most experienced pilots found landing fighter aircraft challenging under normal conditions. Attempting to land an aircraft remotely while flying formation in another aircraft was probably impossible. Edwards Approach, I'll maintain control as long as possible, but you should plan for the possibility of an uncontrolled crash landing.
Copy, Ghost 1.
As they flew toward Edwards, Sarah continued broadcasting audio messages into the F-22's intercom system, hoping to wake the unconscious pilot. She tried everything from loud warning tones to recorded messages about emergency procedures.
Nothing seemed to work.
Then, just as Sarah was beginning to think the situation was hopeless, she saw movement in the F-22's cockpit. The pilot's head lifted slightly, and his right hand moved toward the flight controls. He was regaining consciousness. Sarah immediately began broadcasting voice messages with flight information and emergency procedures. Emergency pilot, this is Ghost 1 flying formation on your right side.
You've been unconscious for approximately 40 minutes. Your aircraft is flying on autopilot toward Edwards Air Force Base. Do you understand this transmission? For several agonizing seconds, there was no response. Then, a weak voice came over the emergency radio frequency.
Ghost 1, this is Captain Martinez.
I copy your transmission.
I'm having trouble with my vision and feeling dizzy, but I think I can take control of the aircraft. Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost overwhelming.
Captain Martinez, you're doing great.
Just take your time and don't make any sudden control inputs. I'm going to guide you through the approach procedures for Edwards. Over the next 15 minutes, Sarah talked Captain Martinez through a gradual recovery to normal flight operations. She helped him assess his aircraft systems, verify his navigation equipment, and prepare for an emergency landing at Edwards. The young pilot was clearly suffering from the effects of whatever had caused his loss of consciousness, but he was alert enough to follow instructions and operate his aircraft safely. Edwards' approach, emergency aircraft is under pilot control with Ghost 1 providing assistance, Sarah transmitted as they entered the airport's airspace.
The landing at Edwards was textbook perfect.
Captain Martinez brought his F-22 down the approach path with Sarah flying close formation beside him, ready to provide assistance if needed.
Emergency crews were standing by as both aircraft touched down safely on the long runway.
As Sarah taxied her F-16 toward the parking area, she felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that followed successful combat missions. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, replaced by the realization of what they had just accomplished. An unconscious pilot had been safely recovered. A runaway fighter aircraft had been prevented from crashing into populated areas. Thousands of lives had potentially been saved.
Ground crews surrounded both aircraft as the engines shut down. Sarah climbed out of her F-16 and was immediately surrounded by Air Force personnel wanting to debrief the emergency mission.
Captain Martinez was being helped from his cockpit by medical personnel, still unsteady but conscious and alert. General Morrison arrived at the flight line within an hour, along with investigators and safety officers who would spend weeks analyzing every detail of the emergency. Sarah found herself answering questions about her decision-making process, her remote control techniques, and her assessment of Captain Martinez's condition during the flight. Colonel Mitchell, General Morrison said privately as the debriefing session ended, "What you did today was either the most brilliant flying I've ever seen, or the most reckless." Sarah considered the general's comment carefully.
"Sir, I think it was probably both."
3 days later, Sarah was back at Riverside Municipal Airport, teaching Kenny Patterson how to perform emergency landing procedures in a Cessna 172. It seemed almost surreal to be discussing engine failures and emergency checklists with a 17-year-old student after spending the previous week briefing Air Force investigators about formation flying with unconscious pilots. Kenny had seen the news reports about the F-22 emergency and the mysterious civilian pilot who had helped save the day. The media had been given minimal information about the incident, but rumors were circulating throughout the aviation community about an extraordinary rescue mission performed by an unnamed flight instructor.
"Miss Sarah," Kenny asked as they performed pre-flight procedures, "did you hear about that fighter pilot who rescued that other fighter pilot? That must have been some pretty amazing flying."
Sarah smiled and continued checking the Cessna's control surfaces.
"Yes, Kenny. I heard about it. I mean, can you imagine flying that close to another aircraft at 30,000 feet? That pilot must have been really experienced."
"Experience helps," Sarah agreed. "But sometimes the most important thing is just being in the right place at the right time." Kenny nodded seriously and continued his pre-flight inspection. He had no idea that he was taking flying lessons from someone whose definition of the right place at the right time included supersonic formation flying with unconscious pilots. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from General Morrison.
"Formal commendation approved. Ceremony next month if you're interested."
Sarah deleted the message and continued teaching Kenny how to check fuel quantity and oil levels. Some stories were worth telling, but others were better kept secret. She had spent 3 years building a quiet, normal life in civilian aviation. Despite the events of the past week, she planned to keep it that way.
"Ready for takeoff?" she asked Kenny as they finished their pre-flight procedures. "Yes, ma'am." "Ready for takeoff." Sarah smiled and climbed into the Cessna.
It was good to be flying again, even if it was just pattern work with a teenage student. Some people were meant for extraordinary adventures, but sometimes the most extraordinary thing you could do was help someone else learn to fly.